Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. I've had a bit of a break lately and have been enjoying the vacation with David and our son, who's home from college. I'm thrilled to be back on YouTube now and apologize for my longer than expected break. I'll do a bit more catching up in future videos, but for today, I want to answer the Philosophy of Reading tag created by Brandon at Brandon's Bookshelf. Lots of booktubers in our little corner of booktube have already answered it, and the questions are really fascinating. So here goes. Question 1. What is most important, a good character, plot, or message? Somehow, I seem to be able to read books without ever really absorbing the plot. I do understand it as I go along, but I don't remember it afterwards. For me, the plot exists just to help me understand the characters. Honestly, I often forget characters' names, and I usually pay absolutely no attention to their physical descriptions. But their perspectives and emotional responses are, in general, what means the most to me when I read. I often resist books with a clear message that hits me over the head, but I do really love more subtle, idea-driven books. Still, I think characters are what is usually most important to me personally. Question 2. Should one read books about ideas or opinions they disagree with? Absolutely, if the work is responsible. I want not only strong thinking, but good research if the book is nonfiction. Although I don't change my mind extraordinarily easily, I might think about an issue in a completely new way after reading a book with ideas I disagree with. And even if I stay firmly committed to the opinions I held beforehand, I might have a lot more understanding of why people disagree with me. I say all this, but I do have my limits. I have no desire to read about highly politicized events, say, without reading or watching some pretty phenomenal reviews from people I highly respect. The third question. As tech advances, what do you think will be the role of books? I think books will remain important in our lives for a long time, although they might not continue to be books in the physical form, that platonic form that's always my first image when someone says book. And I realize that once we get fully acclimated to digital editions or other forms, our whole contemporary idea of what makes a book might change a bit. Still, writing of a certain general length, what we think of as book length, feels almost like a natural expression of humanity at this point. I'm not sure how easy it will be to leave that part behind completely. Okay, number 4, how important are summaries, reviews, and art in your book choosing? Well, cover art sometimes draws me to look at books I don't know about already, but it would never convince me all by itself to choose a book to read. I don't care about summaries per se, but there are certainly books where a brief discussion on the back or on flaps make me know that the general subject and perspective of the book will interest me. But the most important of these 3 choices are reviews. Reviews by people I trust, whether formal written reviews or just personal recommendations from friends, or the middle ground that I enjoy here on BookTube often inspires me to read a particular book. Question 5. Should one ever skim or scan a book? Absolutely. Perhaps this is less true for novels. In nonfiction, I not infrequently find myself skimming large parts of a book, but then reading particular sections of special interest to me quite a bit more closely. That's especially true when I'm reading history or some other more academic study. I don't tend to skim memoirs or narrative nonfiction, but when I'm looking for specific information, skimming or scanning can be important. On to the 6th question, which I think is really interesting. Should reading always be enjoyable? Not necessarily. If one is trying to learn a particular thing from a book, the reading itself need not be enjoyable, even if the learning is. And the slightly more complicated answer is that reading can be an incredibly enjoyable process, even when one does not enjoy the book or the subject. One example would be a heartbreakingly sad book, something that some folks might say is too depressing to read, but others will find deeply meaningful and deeply enjoyable in a certain kind of way. The other is the pleasure that can come when we read something we hate. I very recently got angry at a book, which I had to review formally, and it totally surprised me how much I enjoyed getting all riled up about it. Number 7, is it important to be well read? I keep making these answers really personal, important for me, and I definitely value being well read and often feel embarrassed about how many holes there are in my literary background. On the other hand, I'm not so sure that being well read is of much importance to humanity as a whole. Yes, books are a wonderful way to learn about the world, and a wonderful way to learn to think critically. But they aren't the only way. And then there's the question of what does it mean to be well read? Does it mean knowing all the books that used to be considered clearly canonical? How about all the books we've added over the past 30 years or so that now broaden that canon a bit? How about the ones we haven't added yet, but might in the future, if we keep holding on to the notion of a canon at all? Question 8. What is your book buying process? I really don't have much of an official book buying process, but here's how it often goes. I watch a BookTube video and take notes. I then take that list, which can be especially enormous if I've just watched one of Steve Donahue's videos, and open my public library websites. I search for the books there, and if one of the libraries owns copies, I put those books on hold. If they don't, I open one of the sites that lists used books, and then leave it open as a tab on my browser. And then, at some point, if I think I want the book, even when I compare it to all of the other books in open tabs on my browser, I order it. Once it arrives, I try desperately to imagine where I might possibly be able to store it. I think I need a better system. Okay, question 9. What is your reading process? I read pretty much any time I have some downtime. I usually read for a bit after I tuck myself in for the evening, and then after I turn out the lights, I often listen to an audiobook for a while before I actually go to sleep. I used to start in the morning by reading, but since the early fall of 2016 or so, I usually check the news on my phone, or sometimes listen to NPR for a few minutes instead. My favorite time to read is actually after I put dinner on to cook, but before my spouse David comes out of his current work-from-home room. I pour myself a cup of tea or a glass of wine and pick up either a book or sometimes a magazine with book reviews. I find that time, which is usually pretty short, to be enormously restorative. Number 10, how do you use what you read? Depends on what I've read, but most typically I don't have specific uses in mind. Since I just mentioned reading before dinner, I'll say that I love to read cookbooks, but I rarely actually follow literal recipes. Reading the cookbooks is a way to dream about new adventures. So even when books are potentially clearly of use to many readers, I'm afraid I often subvert that plan, at least to a degree. Question 11 is a question that I had absolutely never thought about before. If you could download a book to your brain, would you still read? I suppose I would say yes, since reading is more about the process than about what I learn, even at least most of the time when I'm reading nonfiction. Number 12, what are your views on rereading a book? I love to reread, and in fact, reread a book twice between American Thanksgiving and New Year's Day. That is, a book I've read in the past, I read a couple of times over break. More on that another time. 13 is a really hard question. What makes a book good? Often, I hope a book will suck me in emotionally, making me think about it a long time after I finish. But that isn't required for me to think a book is good. Very recently, I had a conversation about the so-called flow state with a friend of mine. I think whenever I enter that flow state while reading, I would call the experience of reading that book a good one, even if I wound up being highly critical of the book itself. And now we come to the flip question, what makes a book bad? I absolutely hate books that misuse sources or make claims that go far beyond their evidence. Simple or trite platitudes backed up by absolutely nothing sometimes make me want to throw a book against the wall. On to the next question, number 15. How do you feel about not finishing a book? I have no problem at all abandoning a book because I dislike it. Over the course of the pandemic, though, I've put a few books down in order to read something more pressing, something I have to review or whatever. And I sometimes have trouble picking the book I put down back up. I don't remember ever feeling this way before. Number 16. Should the author's personal life matter at all? Not for reading a book, especially if the author is no longer alive. Choosing to purchase a living author's book, if you abhor the living author, is quite another matter. And certainly it's reasonable for individual readers to decide not to read a book on the grounds that, let's say, a book by a racist or misogynist author is not unlikely to have racism or misogyny in it. There are so many books to read that I often skip stuff that I know is racist or misogynist. But on the other hand, I often don't skip books like that if I think there's some reason why I should know that particular book or might enjoy it in some way. So no, I fully support the idea that, quote, the author is dead. That is, we should take the book on its own grounds, especially if the author actually is dead. If the author's alive, I might not want to put money in their pockets, especially if the author gives money to causes I actively don't want to support. Is that a wishy-washy enough answer? Number 17. If you could only read one genre for the rest of time, what would it be? I suppose literary biography, or 19th century fiction maybe, if we're going to call that a genre. The next question is, do you ever read a book without knowing anything about it? I definitely read books when I know very, very little about them. I don't think I would pick up a book in a brown paper shroud with its title page torn out, but I might if I were desperate enough. Question 19 is, what author, genre, series, or culture can you just not get into? Why? I have yet to be charmed by fantasy novels aimed at adults. Feel free to list your favorites down in the comments and see if you can help me get over that instinct. And finally, the last question. Do you think everyone should read, and why? I mentioned earlier that I was answering these questions about whether something is, quote, important or not, just personally. That is, if something mattered to me, myself. And while part of me wants to say that everyone should read, I don't think I really believe that. On the other hand, I think there are a lot of folks out there who don't read books, who, given time and patience, might really fall in love with reading and be able to learn more about the world and even about themselves from more extensive reading. Well, that will do it for today. Thank you so much for creating this fascinating and very hard list of questions, Brandon. And thanks to all of you for joining me here today for my first video of 2022. See you soon.